Good evening, everybody. I'm Randy Ray. This is the Literate Texan. We're talking about banned Star Trek books and banned or censored episodes of Star Trek tonight in celebration of Book Trek, specifically The Wrath of the Summer of Book Trek, which is the name of the event in 2024. You probably noticed a bunch of videos starting to pop up here and there in your feed from various folks who are either co-hosts or just participants in this year's big summer Star Trek reading event. But tonight I want to talk about books that have been banned that were Star Trek books, which is kind of unusual actually, because, you see the usual suspects when people are talking about banned books, stuff like To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever, but you don't generally hear a lot about Star Trek books that get banned. In fact, I don't have a huge list of Star Trek books that have been banned, but between that and the episodes of the show that have been banned or partially banned or censored in some way, there's actually a lot more to discuss here than you might think. And I'm feeling just a little bit froggy tonight, so I will be taking some sips of water here and there to stay hydrated. But I'll try not to make too much noise with my gulping. Okay, so I've actually taken some notes for this particular show. The first couple of books that I want to talk about that have been banned were banned in prisons in the Florida penal system. These are How to Speak Klingon and Star Trek Adventures, the tabletop role-playing game. Those are both banned in the prisons by the, they don't tell you why, okay? So I've got some speculation based on some of my own personal history. The first one is How to Speak Klingon, okay? So you might be able to make a justification that prisoners in a prison don't need their own secret language. I would argue that Klingon is probably just as useless a secret language in prison as French or Spanish or any of the other languages that might get spoken there. But I do recall a memory from my poker playing days when I used to play poker out in Las Vegas. And I was never a professional poker player, but I did play fairly seriously for a while. And I was on one of my earlier poker trips trying to negotiate a deal with an actual professional poker player. I used to build websites for poker players as part of my job. This particular poker player's name was Minneapolis Jim Meehan. And I had related this story to him about what had happened at the poker table the night before. And I was playing a no-limit game. It was fairly small stakes for a low-limit game, but I decided I was going all in, and I said Carpe Diem at the table. And Carpe Diem, if you've seen Dead Poets Society, you probably know it means seize the day. And the dealer, who was a real charming, I believe he was somewhere in Eastern Europe. He certainly had that look. He was completely shaved bald. But he corrected me very quickly. English only at the table, sir, he told me. I said, oh, sorry, everybody. I didn't know that was a rule here. Carpe diem is Latin for seize the day. It means to live each moment as if it could be your last. Sorry about that, folks. And the dealer glared at me. He likes me even less now than he did before. He glares at me and he says, I know what it means, sir. But if you're using a foreign language at the table, you could be signaling one of the other players. To which I responded, well, couldn't I also be signaling the other players if I used the English translation and said seize the day? And that did not win him over. That did not win the day at all. But I did win the hand, which was cool. So maybe whoever's administering this particular prison was afraid that by allowing the prisoners to speak Klingon, they were going to get some kind of advantage in their next escape attempt. I don't know. It just seems silly to me. The second one on here, Star Trek Adventures, the tabletop role-playing game. Okay, so most people know what Dungeons & Dragons is now. They didn't have to go through the satanic panic of the 1980s like me and my friends did, where they just assumed that you're in league with the devil if you're playing such an awful game. And so anyway, at the time, this was the mid to late 1980s, I was a teenager, but I was also a member of an organization called CARPCA, the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games Association. And one of our missions was to expose people to the therapeutic sides of role-playing games, like Dungeons and Dragons. And so the founder of the organization, or one of the founders of the organization, was the owner of my local bookstore, Paul Cardwell Jr. And he had discussed with the local Texas prisons getting the RuneQuest games in and playable there from in the prisons to see if they could, possibly help people, reform more quickly, or at the very least learn how to work well with others. And absolutely not. We can't have these games. Well, why not? Well, these games use dice to determine the outcomes. So anytime you get dice involved in something, you're gonna start gambling. To which, of course, Paul wanted to know how you could play craps with dice that had 20 sides. That was his big rejoinder to that one. But yeah, it's ludicrous to think that a fantasy role-playing game like, basically Dungeons and Dragons in space with Vulcans, it just seems absurd on the face of it that's somehow going to help a prisoner escape or make them worse criminals or better criminals, depending on your perspective. But that is the most recent edition of the game that is banned in Florida prisons too, by the way, is the Star Trek Adventures from Modiphius Entertainment, which is still in print right now. I believe the first printing was probably in 2016, which means that, in role-playing game terms, that's a pretty old game. So, and then I've got one more prison book banning here to talk about, and that is Star Trek Stellar Cartography, which is banned from prisons in the Oregon prison system. I don't have any idea how stellar cartography is going to have some kind of deleterious effect on the lives of prisoners in prison somewhere. Stellar cartography. I mean, that was one of the coolest scenes in the Star Trek Generations, was where they go to the stellar cartography section, and it's really big, and you can see all the lights and the three-dimensional stuff. But yeah, I don't see any reason that you would ban a book with the locations of the stars on them, unless you're worried that someone's going to navigate their way out of your prison by starlight or something. So those are the 3 books that are banned in prisons. But there was also a book that was not exactly banned, but sort of was banned. Okay, if you're as old as I am, or maybe even a little younger than I am, you probably remember when Star Trek books came out in what they call pocketbook editions. And these were numbered books, which I thought was really cool. I like anything that's numbered because, it's easy to see where the gaps in my collection are. But issue number, or they're not really issue numbers, but the novel number 24 was called Killing Time. And it was published in 1985, so I would have been 15 years old when Killing Time was published. And this is great. So at the time, there wasn't a lot of editorial oversight of the books in the Star Trek series, but there was some. And before there was a lot of publishing going on in the Star Trek niche, there was a lot of fan fiction that was going on in the Star Trek niche. And a lot of this fan fiction had to do with people's fantasies about Kirk and Spock having a love affair, with varying degrees of physicality. Okay. Well, this particular author of this particular book was well known in those circles for writing Kirk/Spock fan fiction. They called it slash. And that's how they would write it. There would be a K/S there. Okay. So she was well known for this in these circles. And she'd written this novel called Killing Time. I don't know much about the plot, but they were between editors at the publishing house. So they sent the copies of the books to, the studio for approval, and they came back and said, oh, yeah, it's approved. We just needed to tone down the whole Kirk and Spock having an affair thing. So, they sent it back, but they're between line editors at the point, and so nothing gets done. The novel doesn't get changed at all. So there's 250,000 copies of this Kirk Spock gay romance book that's literally just been published officially by Pocket Books. And of course, the studio found out about it, got upset. So they started getting those books off shelves as quickly as possible. They made about 50 changes to the book, just different paragraphs, changed some of the dialogue. I don't know if it's a particularly good book or not. I have a copy of it here on my Kindle, but I haven't read it yet. I'm looking forward to seeing it. But if you do have a copy of the original book with the Kirk and Spock sex stuff in it, it's sure to be a collector's item. So that's Star Trek: The Original Series ish. Well, it's not really an issue, but number 24 in the series, published in 1985, and it was called Killing Time. Okay, so those are the only 4 books that I know of that are Star Trek books that have been banned. Okay, but that doesn't mean that censorship hasn't reached other areas of Star Trek, because Star Trek's been around since the 60s, and there were episodes during the 1960s which weren't shown in the United States. And probably the most notable of those was, you probably know what it is too, Plato's Stepchildren, which was season 3, episode 10. And the reason it was controversial and the reason that it faced any kind of censorship at all was because it was the first interracial kiss on American televisions. That was a big deal in, I guess, 1967, 1968, but most of, if not all of the southern United States refused to air this episode. And in fact, I believe, I don't know which came first, the legalization of interracial marriage or the first interracial kiss, but they were right about that same time, that 1967, 1968 time period. So I just thought that was interesting. But what was more interesting to me was there wasn't a lot of censorship or banning of Star Trek episodes in the United States at all. But in Great Britain, on the other hand, they have their equivalent of the FCC, and they were just all over these Star Trek episodes. There were several of them that they didn't show. But basically, excuse me, if it had anything to do with torture, you weren't going to see it in Britain. And also, if it had anything to do with children, you weren't going to see it in Britain. In fact, Great Britain thought of Star Trek more as a children's show than a science fiction show for adults anyway. But the most notable of these was, the most notable one, the first one was an episode called Miri, which I just saw not too long ago, season 1, episode 8. It's got kind of a Lord of the Flies theme to it. They're on this planet and there's all these kids kind of running the shows themselves. There's no adults anywhere to be found. And season 3, there were 3 episodes, episode 10, 12, and 14. The Empath and Whom Gods Destroy. And then, of course, the episode we just talked about, Plato's Stepchildren. And those were all banned in England because they didn't like the torture. They didn't like the way the children were portrayed in those particular episodes either. And that brings us to a total of 9. And everybody loves the top 10 list. And that's about all I could find was one more to round out this top 10 list, which to me is another really odd one. And it's the only one that steps outside of the original series time frame. The Next Generation, season 3, episode 12, was called The High Ground and was censored in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. And you want to know why? There was an offhand remark made by Data in this episode where he indicates that the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom had reconciled and reunified at some point in what would be our future and Star Trek: The Next Generation's past. But the interesting thing about that is that episode is still banned in Ireland. You still can't see that episode in Ireland. So there are probably other instances of banned books that are in the Star Trek vein. The prison database that I looked up the information for example, does not have comprehensive data from every prison in the entire country. And that's just one place where there's a shortfall of data for this sort of thing. But seriously, in this day and age, to ban silly books like this for silly reasons like that is just kind of mind-boggling to me. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little Star Trek video about banned Star Trek books. I will be back soon with some more bookish content. There's a whole bunch of events going on this summer, and I want to talk about almost all of them. But until my next video, stay hydrated, my friends, and stay sexy.